Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood city planner, Senior Director of Legislation and Research at California YIMBY, and one of the new co-leads of the Metropolitan Abundance Project. Welcome back to the Abundance Podcast. In this episode, I chat with Gary Winslett. He's an associate professor of political science at Middlebury College. He's also a senior advisor for the Chamber of Progress and author of their new cost of living agenda. We talk about that agenda. The report is actually called A Democratic Cost of Living Agenda, a low-cost framework for helping families build abundant homes, care, and energy. We talk about all that and more in this episode. Of course, if you're enjoying the Abundance Podcast, please like, subscribe, and leave a review. And with that, on to the show. Gary Winslett, thanks for joining the Abundance Podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's dive right into it. Abundance is kind of having a moment. It's in the name of our organization, Metropolitan Abundance Project. Let's start at a really high level. What is the unifying theme of this abundance moment, and how is it sort of reflected in some of the work you've done?
So to me, the theme about the core theme of abundance is that we're not going to redistribute our way out of shortages. And actually, the best way to help everybody prosper is just have more. In housing politics, there's this musical chairs analogy that everybody loves, right? Like the reason that the slowest kid doesn't get a chair in musical chairs is not because there's anything fundamentally wrong with that child. It's that there's not enough chairs for the kids there. And so fun is a third grade game, but in terms of like actual American society, we don't want there to be people for whom there are no chairs. And so the answer is just, well, let's build more chairs. And so it has this very deep pragmatism to it, but that pragmatism actually puts it, and this is where I think we get to a more interesting part of the answer. It puts it in opposition to a couple of different groups, both to its left and its right. And this is why abundance politics often has centristy vibes to it, even if it's not always like going for like kumbaya moderation. And that it's very sort of pro-growth, and it's going to be very much oriented towards trying to find not just private sector solutions, but also solutions that are not fundamentally about distribution and status. So one group to the right of like abundance politics are people like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, who want to blame immigrants and foreigners for basically every economic problem. Further right than them, you've got like the post-liberals, the Adrian Vermeules, like the people who they want to like a Franco society or something. It's odd, like, but that's not an abundance thing. And then like to the left of abundance, you've got people who really want to blame corporations for like every problem. Like they really, really want the housing problem to be about RealPage, even though it isn't. And to their left, you've got like degrowthers who like are kind of the opposite of the abundance crowd. Like they actually think that there are these hard ecological limits we've got to stay within. And so they're fundamentally opposed to abundance politics. And so that's kind of where I locate it intellectually. And then where it really, the reason it works with how I think so much is I come from trade policy world. And my first book, Competitiveness and Death, Trade and Politics and Cars, Beef, and Drugs, came out with University of Michigan Press in 2021. And a lot of what it's motivated by is trying to get the things we want economically from trade while also promoting progressive social goals, right? Like, and if you think about trade world, like the international trade is something that has lifted billions of people out of poverty. It's a thing that helps working class Americans stretch their paychecks. Right? It's a thing that unites the world post-World War II. It holds the Western Alliance together. It's a part of a global order. There are like these really good things outside of just the economic benefits that we get from trade. Housing is a lot like that. Like, yes, there's a growth to it. Yes, there's an abundance to it. But it also means that like seniors can downsize easily once they want to live on a one-level home. It means, young people without a lot of money, they have the ability to like start a family and have that starter home. There's something to that that's important outside of just money. Like it's not just a money thing. And so it's part of how abundance speaks to me is that it's about growth, but it's about growth for the purpose of human flourishing.
Yeah, no, there were moments in that vice presidential debate that just recently happened that were a little bleak of, right, what's your housing conspiracy theory? Is it immigrants or is it Wall Street?
Oh,
Governor
yeah.
Walz, to his credit, did have a moment where he said, look, we built this many homes and prices fell.
Mhm.
I think, of course, to a lot of folks who listen to this podcast, and certainly you and I, it's obvious, right? We have housing prices are high, we have a
Mhm.
shortage, build more homes. But your work is fascinating to me because it seems like across so many different domains, a lot of people do sort of have this default sort of scarcity kind of zero sum mindset about these
Mhm.
issues. Like, so trade, right? It's like Trump is like the ultimate extreme form of this, of like, if we are winning, someone else has to be losing. There's
Yep.
only a scarce amount of wealth that can be created. What do you think explains that sort of like almost the default salience? Is scarcity mindset like the common sense that you have to like intellect your way out of?
Well, it's one of these things where the first step of the answer is just humans evolved in an extremely scarce environment. When we were hunter gatherers, we were all always on the verge of starvation. And so that's just how humans are programmed, is to like think about the scarcity around them and in very distributional settings. If there's like one berry bush and there's like six people around it, that's tough, man. So I think part of it's that, but I don't think it's all that. I think there's a way in which when people are scared and anxious, they think in much more zero sum ways. And the Great Recession put people in a mood to be scared and anxious. And there was a large period of the 2010s where people were really struggling economically. And when they're struggling economically, the easiest thing for some demagogue to come do is come tell them that their problems are because of those people over there. And so I think that's part of it. And the other thing too is people forget the Great Recession was the worst recession since the Great Depression. It's unusually bad, really, really deep and long lasting. And what it did is it took hold for so long that if you tried to say anything positive about the economy, that was heard as invalidating people's struggles. And so you couldn't say anything positive. And so it created kind of like a ratchet effect where people got darker and darker and darker in their rhetoric, but that only feeds more into the like fear and anxiety, which itself then feeds into zero sum. So I actually think that there was something unavoidable about zero sum instincts taking hold in 2013, 2014, 2015, but I don't think it's automatic now. Like I think you're hearing a sunniness in Harris's campaign that's not been present in a major party campaign since like Obama '08.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really important context too. I mean, also just in the case of trade, right? I mean, the sheer disruption of trade shifts on individual lives, right? I think that's in part what's motivating a little bit of the Trump moment of, yes, in the aggregate, of course, the world is significantly better off from these transitions, but there are individual people who have to deal with the sort of transition costs, right?
Sure. Well, and the other thing too, and this is something that's it's just a fact of life when you study trade, is that when trade opens up new opportunities, but it also creates import competition, the people who win from the new opportunities don't thank trade, they thank their own prowess in the market, which is
Mm,
totally understandable. That's how we all do it, right? Everybody's going to do that. Um, but then the people who lose from trade are like, well, it's not my fault. It's because of the trade. Um, and again, that's not to say that those people are wrong. People work hard and they have every right to feel proud of their own accomplishments. But it is a sort of political imbalance that can happen when trade both creates new opportunities and new risk.
yeah, all of my successes are due to individual efforts and talent and skill, and all of my failures are larger structural problems with the economy.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Well, so I'm curious what you like. So definitely we're operating out of this sort of Great Recession wake of we get this scarcity mindset, and on top of the fact that it's just baked into us. Now it really does seem like abundance is having a moment. What do you think is driving that shift?
Well, I think there's a realization among a lot of Democrats that It is actually Democratic areas in housing that have caused the problem, and it is because they didn't take enough of an abundance mindset. Like, the housing crisis is a national crisis, but it is at its worst in blue cities and blue states. And so people just look around and they get frustrated. And once enough people get frustrated, particularly further up the economic ladder, politicians take notice. But then it's like, okay, well, what do we do about it? Well, okay, in some areas of the economy, you probably do have antitrust problems. I don't want to say antitrust is never the issue, but in housing, it's so clearly not the case that like that's an antitrust problem. Like that's a shortage problem. We don't have enough homes. And so then you start looking into, well, why don't we have enough homes? Well, it's all of these things that create artificial scarcity, whether it's zoning, whether it's height limits, whether it's tariffs on imported lumber, on and on and on. There are all these reasons why we have all these constraints. And so then the natural response just pragmatically is like, all right, how do we address those root constraints? And so that we get more building.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that seems to be what a lot of folks in the abundance space, I'm always hearing, oh, how do we have a YIMBY agenda, but for XYZ? There's this feeling of like, okay, yeah, this recognition of like, we can't just have more stuff comes out of housing, right? Because it's so obvious.
Well, I mean, you say, why can't we just have a YIMBY agenda for XYZ? But that's like kind of what I did with this, cost of living agenda with Chamber of Progress is we were thinking of like, okay, like how do we do abundance politics, not just in housing, but in energy and infrastructure, in healthcare, and in childcare? Because all of these things cost too much. Because this is one of the few areas where I would critique abundance just a little bit, is that it sounds really cool to people like you and I who are like on Twitter and listen to podcasts and like very politically engaged. But if you just go to like regular people, like it's cost of living that annoys them. You say like abundance agenda to them and they don't care. But if you're like, oh yeah, it's housing is too expensive and so is energy, so is healthcare, so is childcare, they're like, yes, thank you. Like that you're at least like recognizing the problem. And so that's actually, even though what we wrote was very much an abundance agenda thing, we framed it around cost of living because that's like what voters care about.
Yeah, there are actual humans on the cover, which is generally a positive thing for a policy document. Yeah, so that's perfect segue. This report that you wrote for Chamber of Commerce or Chamber of Progress, important distinction, a democratic cost of living agenda, a low-cost framework for helping families build abundant homes, care, and energy. And we'll have the link to it in the show notes here. But let's kind of dive right into it here. I think you're exactly right. This is something that, I was seeing some crazy data on this of the frequency with which housing affordability has come up in presidential debates, right? And it's like, it's almost unimaginable as like a national political issue 2 decades ago, right? And now it's like, there's just a large and growing body of survey data that's like, yeah, who would have thought people's number one budget item is actually one of the things they care most about. What is a Democratic agenda for getting housing affordability under control?
So it's really got 3 prongs. So the first thing is you got to reform zoning. And here I would say we've got to stop saying in single family zoning. I think it's off-putting and it's telling people what they lose. I think it would be much better to talk about what we can add. Not just missing middle, but also mixed use zoning, right? We can also, when we reform something like minimum lot sizes, well, what that does is it adds starter homes, minimum lot size, let's say that you have a minimum lot size of a half acre. I mean, a lot of places in New England have like full acre, even 2 acres in some places. But if you've got like this large lot you have to build on, you're not going to build a small home on that because you've already paid so much for the land. So you've got to build a big home that's expensive. Well, when enough people do that because they had to do it because of the minimum lot sizes, you don't have those small starter homes that are great for people just starting a family or great for seniors trying to downsize. Right. And so one of the things that we're arguing for is local zoning needs to be reformed such that we get smaller minimum lot sizes. You could also add housing to commercial areas. If you look at public opinion polling on housing, this is the most positive one. The Pew Charitable Trust did some polling on this, and it is 81 to 18. Do you want to see more housing in commercial areas? So anywhere you've got a commercial area, If you want to just add to it, like add housing to that, that's pretty popular, and people like that. So part of it is zoning. A second part of it that I think a lot of people haven't thought of as much is innovation in new housing types. So the first mass timber building in the United States was until 2011. But this new kind of technology, which allows you to cross-laminate timber, it's got strength to weight ratios comparable to steel and concrete. It's extra fire resistant. It looks great. It sequesters carbon. The 2021 IBC, so the International Building Code, allows mass timber to go up to much taller buildings. So now the tallest mass timber building in the world is in Milwaukee. The new Walmart headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, are mass timber. We're going to see this like real flourishing of this new kind of technology for building. We've just got to make sure we get some of the policies in place to help facilitate that. So when you do mass timber, what you do a lot of the times is you'll do a lot of the construction prefabricated off-site, and then you put it together almost like a Lego set on-site. What that means is, unlike a lot of other housing, you actually get a lot of interstate commerce in that. And so what that means is you actually have a role for Congress just to make sure that standards are the same across those state lines to help facilitate that interstate trade. One of the other things we talked about was the chassis rule. So this one's near and dear to my heart because I grew up in a mobile home. And this kind of affordability, like it matters to people in exurban and rural areas. Well, there's a rule, but dating back from the 1970s, that says that any small manufactured home, mobile home, has to be on a chassis as if it were going to be moved. Nobody moves those anymore. That's pointless. It adds to cost. It adds to stigma. There's no reason to have that. And getting rid of that is actually a really easy change. You basically change one definition in a federal code to stop requiring that in the definition.
And do we know where this requirement came from in the 70s?
Yeah, so there was concern, by concern I mean lobbying, from builders of matchstick homes, basically the builders of the sort of simplest in-place homes that did not want competition from small manufactured housing. Those have basically gone away as mostly business entities. So the primary constituency that lobbied for it, wish they hadn't been given that little special favor, but they're not even there anymore. And so there's a real, in my view, political opening across the political spectrum to get that reform done. And so this is one of the things that I was really proud of in our report is we didn't just do a lot of 30,000 foot discussion. We went into all these different, very specific, very pragmatic policy reforms that can actually help.
Let's talk a little bit more about mass timber too, because I mean I've seen the building in Milwaukee, and you mentioned this. It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to having all these other benefits, the IBC has changed the provisions around this. Would this be what's the actual policy that needs to change, whether at the federal or state level here?
So only about half of states have adopted that new IBC. So it would be helpful if the other half of states did that. Now, Congress could always do some carrots on that, if they want to. But the other big thing that the government can do is through HUD, potentially through NIST, maybe some other agencies, just ensure that regulations are facilitative of mass timber, and that they are aligned state to state. And this is another thing that if there will be a lot of, we did not go a ton into tax policy in our report just because there will be a whole tax-mageddon set of negotiations next year around, the end of parts of the TCJA and all kinds of other stuff. You could do a mass timber tax credit. There are all kinds of things around that you could do. We've got tax credits for all kinds of other stuff. This is one that could be helpful. You could do workforce training in it. You could do full or faster expensing, R&D. You could do some tax credit stuff around here if you wanted to.
So while we're wading through the weeds, a couple other weedy issues that have taken on a mainstream salience: single stair reform, and elevators.
Mm-hmm.
as I understand, these are both issues too that are mostly dictated by as a matter of what code states have and have not adopted,
Yeah.
similar to the issue we were just discussing.
So this is one where so let's take them each at a time. Point access blocks, and then elevators. In most of the world, if you've got a smaller building, you only need a single staircase because there are many routes to fire safety. You can have concrete walls, you can have sprinklers, and all kinds of ways to make a place fire safe. You don't have to have two staircases. In the United States and Canada, for any building basically taller than about 3 stories, you need 2 staircases to make sure that it's fire safe. Well, that comes with fire safety, which is good, but it also has all these drawbacks. Every apartment building feels like a hotel. It's got that one central corridor where everything's loaded off of. It means all the apartments are pretty much the same size. It's not great for cross ventilation. It's not great for sunlight. It's not great for noise. It's not great for family style apartments. And so there's just all these problems. And you end up taking a lot of floor space up that you can't rent out because of that, with between the 2 staircases and the central hallway. And so the argument runs that you could reform this by allowing those alternate routes to fire safety. Right. So instead of having the 2 staircases, you have the 1 staircase, but like in Germany, you have regulations about how far it is from the door to the 1 staircase. You have regulations about how many units can be on a floor. Right. These are not going to be enormous buildings with only 1 staircase. It's going to be a 5-story building with 3 or 4 units of floor. These are about creating more family-sized apartments and doing it in smaller and more irregular lots. And it could be really good for smaller builders. So there's all these pros to it. But you always come back to the fire safety point. And so this is where, at a political level, I think the first thing you've got to do in any state and locality that wants to actually do point access block reform, you got to have the firefighters on board from day one. If they oppose you, you are dead. It is game over. And so, but if you can get the firefighters on board with it, persuade them, help, have them write your model code. If they're on board with it, then all of a sudden it's got legs, right? Because if the firefighters are saying, hey, look, this building that's going to be 4 stories, 4 units per story, we see how these 1-hour firewalls plus the sprinklers plus the size mean that you only need 1 stairway. If the firefighters are saying that, you've got the potential for that political win. If you try to bring in the firefighters at like step 9 and they feel like that was their jurisdiction from the beginning and they're annoyed with you, or they just don't like your designs, you're dead in the water. Like, that's not going to work.
I mean, I think a challenge here is something I've been surprised as this policy space has gotten legs, is the extent to which this sort of fire establishment does not really seem to be motivated by the actual fire science at issue with some of these cases. So, I mean, I've heard from multiple local and state elected officials who have done work on this, where they're like, we went to the fire marshal and the fire marshal said, sure, I'll sign off on it if you buy me an extra truck and hire 2 more like firefighters. Like, no, they didn't, no interest in them. Or a lot of fire marshals, I didn't realize this until recently, a lot of fire marshals have no training. They're just former firefighters. They have no formal training in fire science or fire engineering, which was kind of shocking.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying to violate any sort of corruption laws or anything like that, but if there is some sort of trade-off that can easily be given in exchange for okaying on that, that's not the worst thing. If they want an extra fire truck in exchange for signing off on point access block reform, and that's going to get you a lot of new housing and family style apartment units. All right, like, sausage got to get made somehow.
Sure. Yeah, no, I understand. And I think on this area in particular, reformers really need to do a better job of doing a little bit more proactive outreach first. And I think we're getting there. I mean, I think with building codes, it's another thing that's sort of been fascinating to me about that reform space is it's so much more opaque than zoning and subdivision regulations and other, for all of the problems with zoning, you can go find your municipal zoning code online.
Yep.
It's broadly intelligible. Building code, right, this is a proprietary document. It's almost by design only meant to work for professionals. You do not have access to it unless you pay a lot of money. And then the reform procedures happen at a faraway place, where you need to be like a dues paying member or something to even be a part of the conversation. Right?
It's wild how long the chain of logic is on the building code side to getting any reform done. Right. So like there's all kinds of new refrigerants that are starting to come online in other parts of the world. And the United States voted as part of the international standard setting body to allow that. So it's not even like the US is opposed. We're just so slow in uptaking those regulations that we haven't even done that yet. And it's not even about like stiff opposition. It's just inertia.
It's true of many areas. Of course, we all love point access blocks and single state reform. Your report also embraces 5/1s. There's some like single stair advocacy where people have like almost gaslit themselves into thinking 5/1s are bad.
No, I love 5/1s.
Right, they're the workforce of housing affordability. Do you want to say on that?
I literally peg the meter in terms of enthusiasm for 5/1s. 5/1s. You will not find somebody who is more enthusiastic about these. So if you don't know what a 5/1 is, there are a lot of the new apartment buildings you see going up these days are 5/1s. Now, what a lot of people think those mean is 5 floors of housing over 1 floor of retail. And that's intuitive, fine. But what it actually comes from is you've got type 5 building, which is basically light lumber, over 1 floor of type 1 construction, which is concrete, basically. And so what that allows you to do is it allows developers to hit this sweet spot, because if you don't build high, then you can't get a whole lot of units on a given plot of land, right? You're only going to get so much there at 2 floors. Okay, but if you go really tall, things get really, really expensive because you've got to do all kinds of engineering, safety, wind. Like it's really expensive to build a tall building. Well, the 5/1 is this perfect sweet spot that allows you to maximize units for minimum cost. And you can actually get, depending on exactly how you do it, between 80 and 110 housing units an acre with 5/1s. This is why I say they're the workhorse for housing affordability. So one of the things Tim Walz could have pointed out in the VP debate is that the combination of housing reforms that Minneapolis did, getting rid of parking minimums, allowing mixed-use zoning, increasing some of their height restrictions. What that allowed to happen is an explosion of 5/1 apartment buildings. And that is why Minneapolis housing unit numbers went up and their rents went down and their homelessness went down compared to other places in Minnesota. If you look, and there was a study done on this, the vast majority of the units that came online were not actually from duplex, triplex reform. Much as we love that, and much as that would be cool in suburbs, it's not where most of the units came from. Most of the units came from 5/1s. You can get a lot of new housing there. If you want it, people talk all the time about how they want these dense, walkable spaces. They go to Europe and they have a great time, and they're like, why can't we have this? Like, the reason we can't have this is because we don't have enough 5/1s. Like, literally anywhere in the country, up to and including New York City, if you just made it legal to build lots of 5/1s without doing anything else, literally without doing anything else, just get rid of the parking minimums and the stuff that make those impractical, height limits, whatever, you would immediately have the kind of dense, walkable urbanism everybody under 40 says they want. Mm-hmm. So just like do that. I hear these like aesthetic complaints, and like, I'm sorry, the world is not your canvas if you're an architect. Like, if you want to be an artist and go draw or paint, that's fine, but housing is 20% of the economy. It's how people live. The housing market is not your canvas. Knock it off with the aesthetic concerns. People's aesthetics change all the time. People thought the Eiffel Tower was ugly when they were building it. People thought the brownstones in New York City and Philadelphia were ugly when they were building them. Do we get it wrong sometimes? Sure. You know what we're allowed to do when we get it wrong? Fix it. You know what used to be ugly as all hell is Government Center in Boston. And like, looks a lot better now because they fixed it up. They planted trees. They made little walkways. Like, it's better. You can just, if something goes wrong, you fix it. like this fear of like, oh, I don't like the way the 501 is. Like, stop it. People need a place to live.
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple things on this. I think one, right, in the long term, yeah, let's fix some of these building code rules that make it impossible to build anything other than a 5/1, so people can have choice and more courtright buildings, more point access plots. That'd be great. I think even in that scenario, right, you're still going to get a lot of 5/1s.
Yeah.
Like, I lived in one, and frankly, it's probably the nicest unit that I've lived in as an adult when I lived in one in DC.
Yeah.
But I think another really important point with 5/1s, and you get at this is a form of housing that the market can build a lot of and at an inherently very affordable rate tomorrow, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think this is, of course, in the longer term, we want an economy that, we have point access blocks and a range of different multifamily style buildings. We want missing middle, we want we want cottage courts, we want duplexes.
Yep.
But a lot of those are typologies that have been illegal for 100+ years, and that it's just going to take time for our market to rebuild around those. Whereas, exactly to your point, 5/1s, and this is true in almost every major American city that had a major supply surge that's keeping its rents and housing affordability under control, including, for example, Austin. They just built a ton of 5/1s.
Yeah.
There was really they weren't building skyscrapers or like tons of missing middle. They were building tons of 5/1s. All right. Yeah, and I mean, I think another sell too for people is, in many cases, these are being redeveloped on the sites of tired old strip malls or empty office parks that, there's none of the discourse around displacement or losing sort of historic sort of assets, right? Let's talk about another one that you have here, relegalizing SROs. I think some people listening to this might know what an SRO is, but do you want to talk a little bit more about that and what the actual policy prescription would be for that?
SRO is single room occupancy. And this is basically where you have a room. It's going to be pretty bare bones. It's got a bed, maybe a sink. The door locks. It's pretty small. You got a closet. You're going to share kitchen and bathroom facilities with other people on the floor. It is the most basic form of housing we know of that we've ever seen built at scale. There were lots of these back in like New York City 100 years ago. No one thinks these are the ideal form of housing, but you know what they beat the hell out of? Homelessness. They're the last, if you think about housing as a ladder with mansions at the very top and homelessness at the very bottom, SROs are that last rung before you've fallen into homelessness. And we made them illegal. Cities and states went to war against them out of all kinds of classist and racist motivations. They didn't want poor people, particularly poor people of color, anywhere near them. And so, New York City did every single thing it could to get every SRO it could to turn into a hotel. And cities across the country did this. And what it meant was you took that housing ladder and you broke to smithereens the bottom rung on it. And so it's no surprise that is one of the main ingredients to high homelessness that we see. And so we need more. We need to re-legalize SROs. And this is not a thing cities are going to do willingly. This is one of the few kind of coercive things that we talked about in the report. Is we wanted to basically, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, where the federal government has jurisdiction to guarantee access to housing, we wanted to say that if you're above a certain level of homelessness, your state has to re-legalize SROs. So if you look at homelessness across the country, it varies massively from state to state. So the U.S. average is about 11 per 10,000 people. So across the United States, for every 10,000 people, about 11 are homeless. Okay, well, that varies a lot. There's a lot of states. So like where I grew up in Alabama, it's only 7. I think Mississippi is the lowest at 3. There's a lot of states in the single digits. But the state I live in now in Vermont is 51. It's just behind California at 52. New York's not far below them. There's about 5 states that are over 40. And that's a lot of like 50 out of 10,000 people. All right, you're talking 5 out of 1,000. That's 1 every 200. 1 every 200 people is homeless. You messed up somewhere along the line if 1 in every 200 people in your state is homeless, and you've shown yourself, at least currently, not up to the task of housing people with little to no income. And so SROs being re-legalized in those places, it's not quite as carroty as some of our other policy responses, but it's likely necessary, and it would go a long way to alleviating suffering. Like, being homeless is horrible, like absolutely horrible. Even if you're like not like in the street, if you're in a car, that's still terrible. Like, oh my God, like, we have failed these people in awful ways, and we have a moral responsibility not to continue doing that. And so, like, re-legalizing SROs is about that. It's about not failing at this very, very easy moral test.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people, one of the convenient excuses people lean on with the homelessness crisis is that, well, it's all just substance abuse and mental health disorders, as if being homeless does not make you susceptible to developmental health and substance abuse problems.
Yeah, right? I think most people, if they were forced to be homeless for a week, would really like a stiff drink at the end of the week.
Right.
It's a really tough week to go through.
And on SROs, are we seeing a lot of progress here? I've heard Houston is building some SROs, but it does seem like one of the areas of reform. We've had a few states pass single-stair reform bills. We've had a lot of states pass multifamily streamlining bills. What's going on with SRO legalization?
Nothing. Not to my knowledge. Maybe a few places, a few things here and there around the margins. This is one of these ones where I think you're going to have more of a beefy federal response. And this is also one of those things where I think you got to be politically really savvy about it. Republicans do not like encroaching on the federalism of housing policy. So this is part of the reason why we wanted to focus this on states with high homelessness, because except for Alaska, there are no red states above 20 per 10,000. And most aren't even above like 10 or 15. And so if Republicans don't think this is ever going to hit red states, maybe they'd be for it. It's politically very challenging. But also, given what we've seen from, the Supreme Court and their various decisions, it seems to us that it was the most direct way to actually fixing homelessness rather than just talk about it and scapegoat. Because there's a lot of talking about it and a lot of scapegoating and a lot of wishing for a different world. And on one level, I get all that because it really is, detrimental to homeless individuals and society. But we sort of felt that we had a responsibility to say something useful and practical. And to us, that was SROs.
Well, and so I'm curious, again, dipping into, I think, some of your political science expertise. One of the fears I think I and some others have about this housing affordability issue becoming more salient at the national level is this issue of the issue becoming partisan, right? So, I mean, one of the unusual features of this zoning reform moment is that it's bipartisan. It's happening in red and blue states.
Yep.
And I look at the presidential race, for example, and I see, okay, the Democratic Harris ticket's actually kind of leaning into the YIMBY moment. Trump is leaning into the more NIMBY moment. Is this going to have down ticket implications that mess with the issue?
So one of the things I will often go back to in terms of housing politics is I'm a big believer in private property rights. If you own a plot of land and you would like to build a duplex on it, subject to, some basic fire and safety stuff, you should just get to. That's a private property rights argument that I could totally understand many conservatives and more libertarian types being a big fan of. There are some political topics that are inescapably partisan. I don't think housing has to be it. I don't see why it's ineluctably going to be partisan.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and I think you have to be mindful to make different arguments in terms of different values. But I want to get to, I think, two of the big risks, frankly, for housing affordability. Even if states and cities do everything right, if we have very, very high tariffs on all the inputs and then extremely strict labor rules, those are the big inputs for housing costs. You talk about that in the report. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that was the third prong of what we were saying about housing. The first thing, zoning. The second thing, innovation in housing types. The third one is embracing globalization. And I get that at a sort of abstract level, that's not going to be everybody's favorite meal. but like actually in housing, it could really help. So right now we tax imports of Canadian lumber at over 14%. Why are we doing that? Like that doesn't make any sense in a housing shortage.
We can't be vulnerable to the Canadians,
Yeah.
try to, invade us, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, so on something like semiconductors in China, I at least understand like the national security argument, the argument for like building it here. Like I get it, I really do. But like, come on, this is Canada. These are our neighbors and our greatest allies, and like this, they're softwood lumber mecca, and we should just allow imports of that and build a lot of homes with it.
And you're not just saying that because you're so close to the border. You would be, first affected by the invasion. You want to be in their good graces, right? That's why you're saying all this stuff.
Of course. Yeah, no, well, it's funny living so close to the border. Like I'm one of those few Americans for whom a Canadian city is my nearest city. So like if we want to go to like IKEA, we go to the one in Montreal. Or like if we want to go, have a nice city weekend. It's not New York, which is 6 hours away. It's Montreal, which is hour and a half. So yeah, I love Canada anyway, but we're not going to get into that and my trade stuff. Let's just talk about timber. Yeah, if you want to, so one of the things people consistently state and underappreciate about international trade is that a huge proportion of our imports are actually inputs into other stuff we're making, right? So something like 40 to 50% of all goods imports are actually inputs. We're using them to make other things. And so when you make those more expensive, you actually make it more expensive to build things here in America. So if you're going to make timber or lumber more expensive, that makes it more expensive to build housing here in America. If you want to make, sort of raw glass or raw lumber or raw steel more expensive, you're going to make it more expensive to do manufacturing here in the United States. And then the other thing that links up into is if we want to build a coalition that can contain the Chinese Communist Party, we actually have to work with our allies on that. Like we can either be Fortress America or we can be at the head of a China containing coalition, but we cannot do both. And so working with our allies like Canada to allow more imports of Canadian softwood lumber makes a lot of sense in a bunch of different directions. So that's part of it. It's just making lumber cheaper. And the other part of it is not deporting huge portions of our workforce that work in housing construction. Like it or don't, significant percentages of the people who work in housing construction, particularly some of our most dangerous jobs like roofing, are undocumented immigrants. And we have studies that show when you do mass deportations in certain areas but not others, the ones where you see those deportations have a significant slowdown in housing construction. And so, deporting our construction workforce is also not going to help build out housing. Now, I know J.D. Vance got on an interview the other day where he tried to rebut this, and he talked about how, we used to build in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and we didn't have a ton of immigrants then. I get that as a conceptual point, but as a pragmatic here and now point, most of the people who work in housing construction are immigrant. Not most, but many are immigrants. It doesn't make sense if we're trying to get out of this housing slump, out of this housing production slump, to be deporting the builders.
Huge tariffs on inputs and deporting huge portions of the labor force would be a big issue. I mean, I think there has to be a broader conversation about construction labor in particular, of just how we've completely gutted our supply, especially of skilled construction labor.
Yep.
But from where we're at right now, it's like, don't deport the labor force you have.
Sure, exactly. I mean, if you were to ask me like what are the two great failures of American political economy? One is just like how threadbare our social safety net is for poor children. But the other is that we have very thin, hardly funded, poor active labor market policies. And what I mean by that is we don't help people get jobs. We don't help people transition between jobs. As a percentage of GDP, Denmark spends like 20 times as much on this as we do. We're just not helping. We're not helping people in that way that we should be. And what it means is that there are like fewer on-ramps to the American dream than there should be. And so this gets at, young men who are dissatisfied, but it also gets at educational polarization, And it also gets at housing construction, right? If you've got fewer of those on ramps to the skilled trades, well, then that means you've got a shortage of people who can do those. And so this is one of the areas in which I think our public policies have like capital F failed, and we need to like rethink why and fix it.
I want to touch on a few other things. Obviously, housing is kind of our bread and butter, but we're broadly interested in making cities work.
Mhm.
And I think a major barrier to this sort of the scale of infill that we know we need is you also have to scale up mobility infrastructure. And of course, we're very bad at this in the US.
Yep.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about an abundance agenda for urban mobility?
So this is actually something we talked about in our infrastructure section of our report, is the problem of procurement. So the way we do procurement in the United States, we sort of treat it like Ezra Klein called it everything bagel liberalism. I actually prefer 9 birds, 1 stone liberalism. So you got these like 9 different birds you're trying to hit, and you're trying to hit it with 1 stone. Well, like what's going to happen in practice? You're going to hit none of them. And so what we do with our procurement in the United States is we've got all these different things we wanted to do. You've got to not just build, you've got to make no noise above the street. You've got to not change anybody's view. It's got to hit all these other separate metrics. Some of it's going to get outsourced to NGOs and nonprofits. This is particularly a problem. Hate to say it, in places like California, instead of having real estate capacity. And so you just end up getting garbage that's expensive. On Twitter, it went wild. There was this thing called La Sombrita, which was this bus stop. And it was just like this little, basically a sign with like a curved top. And it cost like over $100,000. San Francisco had like the $1 million toilet. Our construction costs are multiple times what they are in other countries. And this has a couple of problems. One, it means we just get less infrastructure because we're paying a ton of money for it, but it also undermines public support for paying the taxes for the infrastructure. And it's very rational if you think about it. Like if you're a taxpayer and just looking around and you're like, well, I pay taxes and I didn't get anything for my money. Like the next day, unless you're wired in a certain kind of way, you don't come around to being like, oh, I want to pay more taxes. You're like, no, just cut the taxes. If you're not going to give me a good deal on it, just like, let's not pay those. And so then you got lower tax morale. And so part of it is we've got to stop letting every group that says it's an interest group get their little cut of the action. And that's where you got to have a little bit of spine. So you got to have a little bit of courage. You're going to build things as quickly as you can and as cheaply as you can. And there are all kinds of, sort of micro recommendations we had in our report about how to fix procurement. That's one of those areas, though, that as much as there's these like micro changes you can make, it's about a culture. And that's one of these areas where I think you actually could bring in more bipartisanship, is like taking taxpayers' interests seriously. Like that's bread and butter Republican thinking. And so if you can combine Republicans' insistence on taking taxpayers' interests seriously with Democrats' insistence on making sure that there's good infrastructure, that's a winning formula culturally. But we got to just like get that right instead of what we currently do. So that's what I would say on procurement. In general, on transit, this is where I would go with another sort of potentially Republican talking point. You got to make it safe. If people are not going to take the subway if there's someone doing hard drugs near them on the subway. They just won't. And that's perfectly reasonable. So if you want people to be in public spaces and use public transit, you're going to need to not fight fire with marshmallows when it comes to public safety. Sometimes that's going to be a tougher response than I think some people on the left want there to be.
Or even just presence, right? I mean, I think there's, presence and sort of 100% risk of apprehension in the case of a violation.
Yep.
With relatively light consequences can do most of the heavy lifting. I think that's absolutely Right. I know that you all also talk about e-bikes and bike lanes, which I think
Mhm.
often sort of left out of these conversations. You want to say more about that?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about e-bikes. They make biking obviously a lot easier. They make it not just for, spandex kind of people. Um, and I think it could be really great for getting people around urban spaces. The thing is, though, you got to make sure it's safe. Um, I own a bicycle. I literally only go on recreational paths with it because I'm not sharing the road with a car. Just won't do it. There's lots of people out there like me in all kinds of urban spaces who would gladly take an e-bike for any trip under 2 miles in nice weather. But that means they got to have somewhere safe to do that. Now the thing about it is, here's what's great about bike lanes. As long as you have the political will to take space away from cars, you've already got your bike lanes. You need some paint and you need some barriers that are not high tech. It's just not that expensive or that hard to do if you've got the will to take space from cars. And so we were also really excited about that. E-bikes are another area where there's a new technology here that can make things really great for a lot of people.
Right, or even just the broader ecosystem of electric micromobility, right? I mean,
Mhm.
neighborhood electric vehicles essentially, I don't, we have to call them something new because we can't just call them golf carts, right? But I mean, for the vast majority of urban trips, which, like you say, are only 2 or 3 miles, that's a perfect sort of vehicle, and you can have it be climate controlled as well for, the pickier sort of
Yeah.
commuter.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, in the villages in Florida, that's like 90% of trips is these like golf carts.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, no, it's cheaper, and I mean, I think another issue too that's happening concurrently to just our inability to scale up is our streets are becoming a lot more dangerous. All right, and you just
Mhm.
have a lot more traffic violence, and I think you know part of this is because of the increasing size of and weights of vehicles. Part of it's because I think you have more people in urban environments biking and walking, and we just haven't redesigned our infrastructure to reflect that.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the New York Times did a really interesting investigation on this, on like what was leading to increased pedestrian deaths in the United States. And they actually pointed to the biggest factors being sort of a combination of a couple of things. One is a lot of our population growth has been, like you say, in places that are warmer weather, like Florida, Texas, Arizona, that don't have good pedestrian infrastructure. Uh, Combined with more and more people on their phones when they should be driving. And then they pointed out something that's really interesting. Part of the reason you don't see this in the EU is because they have so much more manual transmission. Because if you've got manual transmission, you don't have the free hand.
Right,
Whereas
right.
99% of cars in the US are automatic transmission. And so you got the free hand to be on your phone. And so they actually, it was really interesting investigation that they did. That it was just like it was actually like that being the combination, and that the bigger trucks don't help in terms of like sight lines, and they're definitely making some crashes like more deadly because they're so big. But a lot of the pedestrian deaths are also involving just like little cars because it's
Right.
just like you get hit by a little car going 50, you still got hit by a car going 50 because they weren't paying attention because they were on their phone in a place where it's not safe to walk.
Yeah, I missed that chapter in the copy that you sent me of your report of mandating manual transmission, but I'm sure
I
it's
did not. That's not part of the abundance agenda. Mandating manual transmission. No, no, we're not going to do that. There are other ways to reduce, pedestrian fatalities than that.
I hope so. The third prong here that I think would be just interesting to cover, and there's a lot of great stuff in here on energy infrastructure, healthcare, which of course are minor issues that folks might have heard of. But third prong of the California YIMBY agenda is we say we want to make California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, just the this is another crisis to me where I'm continually baffled that we don't talk about it more, which is the cost of childcare.
Mhm.
You have a lot of material in here. Where do we start on
Yeah.
bringing those costs under control?
So childcare is somewhat unlike those first three areas in that it's not a thing you can just easily do more output on. The reason childcare is expensive is because it's labor intensive. In that report, I opened up talking about this thing Agatha Christie said, which is that right after World War One, she was living in London, and she was looking back on that time, and she said she couldn't have imagined being so rich to own a car, nor so poor not to have servants, which is remarkable to modern ears. You're like, wait, what? And it's because back then labor was really cheap and capital was really expensive. And today we have just the opposite. It's actually like capital that's really cheap. Like, we've all got these like nice computers and phones in our pockets, capital goods aplenty. And so it's people's labor that's really expensive. Well, like early childcare is very labor intensive. It's really not safe for babies to have more than about 4, maybe in an extreme case, like 5. And even then that's tough. Like you really need, for babies, you need like not more than 4 per adult taking care of them. It's just really labor intensive. And there's no way around that. So then you got to think about, okay, well, what can you do understanding that? And we really wanted to include this in our report because the thing that really hurts people in terms of cost of living, like we knew this was our challenge and that there aren't a ton of great answers, but like when we just talk to people, like, there's pretty good data that people are having fewer children than they want to have. And the number one reason for that is because it's expensive. And like, I have a 5-year-old, I'm a father. So I find that heartbreaking in a certain kind of way. Because I know what fatherhood means to me. And so it's really sad that would be the case. And so I take it as a real responsibility as somebody who was working on this to have something productive to say about it. And so what we ended up saying is that there are a couple things you can do on childcare provision. So you can slightly relax some of these child to teacher ratios as they get a little older. In some states it's 10-1. Once they hit 3, you could maybe go to 12-1. In some states it's 6-1 when they hit 2.5. Maybe you could have that start at 22 months. You can do some small relaxations around things that don't, go Dickensian or whatever. Local zoning in some places makes it very hard to build new daycare centers. Utah is particularly bad about this. In some places, you're always going to have some occupational licensing on childcare providers, but some places go too far with this. In DC, you have to have a college degree. Like, that's insulting to look at people and say, oh, you didn't go to college, you're not smart enough to take care of children. And that just creates a constrained supply on childcare. I mean, de facto, we require a degree in Vermont. It's not literally written into it, but the number of credit hours you have to have, you basically have a degree at that point. Californians are in that direction as well. So we want we're basically saying don't go overboard with your occupational licensing. We also talked about an expanded child tax credit because this is something that would be relatively neutral in the culture wars. If you're just giving people money, well, that can help the 2-earner household who wants to send a child to formal daycare at a center. But that also helps the household that has 1 full-time earner and 1 part-time, or it helps the household that has 1 full-time earner, 1 stay-at-home parent, right? Like it's neutral between all of those. So we like that a lot. And the other section of that report that we talked about, this is why we called this the section Raising Children, because it's more than just about daycare. We talked about the need for a universal free school lunch. It's great bang for the taxpayer buck. It's not that expensive. You're saving money because you're not having, one of those workers standing there collecting the money. It reduces stigma. If everybody's getting the free lunch, it's not like associated with poverty. It's one of those things for parents to have to do. The kids focus better. It's good for learning outcomes. There's just a lot of really good things that come out of free school lunch. It's not that expensive. It really isn't. And then we also talk about Medicare for kids, which is also cheaper than a lot of people think it would be because kids' healthcare needs are usually pretty cheap. I mean, you do get a rare kid that gets quite sick, but for the most part, children have very routine checkups, vaccinations, that kind of stuff. So providing Medicare for kids is another way of making raising children more affordable. And that was another thing that we wanted to say because this it's funny, like you're always supposed to be a little bit cynical, but this project actually came from like an extremely earnest place of just like trying to help people like live better lives. Like, this is a podcast, so obviously you listeners can't see anything. But I'm in my office and there's all these like books behind me.
Well,
and,
we're
like,
recording video, so
we're recording video too.
For this so far.
Oh, okay, so they'll see that. All right.
Sorry, I should have mentioned that.
That's all right. There's all these books behind me, and like it's cool. Like I like being a nerd, But like when I had the opportunity to write something that might actually help real people live better lives because they're not, having all these things like eat their income alive. That seemed like a thing I wanted to do, and like childcare is part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we've got a plan to help more kids come along and then find them a place to live and then move around. As we wrap up here, there's a whole bunch of other sorts of things that come up in this report. Maybe something we've not discussed so far. What do you think is the most underrated policy intervention in this report?
That we didn't discuss so far. Um, hmm. Removing the residency cap on doctors. Back in the late 90s, Congress basically put a cap on the number of residency spots. So now there are people who have like the determination and the smarts to make it through medical school, and there's just not a residency spot for them. And so they just get shunted out of the system altogether, which is crazy. It's contributing to a doctor shortage, and doctors for understandable reasons, by the time they've gotten through residency, they've often put down roots in that location. They've gotten married or they like it there or whatever. And so de facto, this freeze on the residency number of spots and its locations has meant that we have an extra acute shortage of doctors in the places growing the fastest. And so like that's a huge problem. And so that's one of the things that if you ask me for like just one out of our healthcare section, since we didn't talk much about healthcare as a thing we should do, that would be it, is removing that cap. And the original organization that argued for it, the American Medical Association, doesn't even like it anymore. So like there's actually an open door to get this done. Like, in this report, we really try to focus on things that are politically doable. And like removing that cap is doable. There's even a bill in Congress written by Terry Sewell, Democrat of Alabama, that would relax this cap. We'd like to see it not just be relaxed, but kind of super relaxed. But at least that's a step in the right direction. So, that may have legs in the next Congress.
Fantastic. Well, if you want to learn more about the healthcare proposals, you'll have to go read the full report. Again, it's a democratic cost of living agenda, a low-cost framework for helping families build abundant homes, care, and energy. This was with the Chamber of Progress. Gary, thanks so much for joining to chat about it, and I look forward to having you on in the future to chat about how all of these policies have been implemented, and it's all because of this report, right?
Thanks, Nolan. I love your book, and it was such an honor to be on here with you today.